Welcome to Global Journalist Extended. This is Byron Scott, your host, and we welcome you to this new online feature. We'd tried to have Anthony Shadid from the New York Times on our show last week, but Anthony was very, very busy in Cairo, and he continues to be. But we're delighted to have him now as a Global Journalist Extended guest. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
For those who don't know, Anthony Shadid is a foreign correspondent for the New York Times based in Beirut. He's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner and author of Night Draws Near, the Ridenhour Book Prize book for 2006. And Anthony, you've been in and out of Tahrir Square in Cairo these last several weeks, covering that story. And as I told you before we went on the air, I was struck by a quote in the last, at least the last piece I've read by you, in which you said, have a quote saying, now it feels like Hosni Mubarak is playing a game of who has the longest breath. Could you expand on that and give us a look at the current picture?
Quote, sure. What was remarkable about that quote, I think, was how it distilled, in some ways, the struggle that's going on here in Cairo or Egypt, by extension, and that is, can the resources of the state, a state that still has a monopoly on the use of violence, can it outlast or even crush what stands as perhaps the greatest uprising in the modern Arab world? We have two very different forces that are colliding against each other, and often you hear ultimatums used to describe them. Is it freedom or chaos? Is it stability, or is it stability or disorder? Each side is trying to frame it a certain way. Each side is deploying what it can, and I think what we've kind of moved into is a prolonged tug of war in some ways on who's going to come out on top, and it's still very undecided. What we've seen from the protesters for 3 weeks now is an ability to turn out hundreds of thousands of people seemingly at a whim, but we've also seen the government be able to endure an uprising that represents the greatest challenge to that regime and endure it still standing up. It's staggered at times, it's lost its balance, but it still in some respects is able to seize the initiative from time to time.
And do you see this as a standoff now, or do you see signs perhaps of maybe a breakthrough?
Standoff, I think, suggests a certain kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, a certain kind of balance or a certain kind of stability in the equation, and I don't think you see that. It's a very fluid situation still. And like I said earlier, we have seen the momentum shift almost by the day. On Monday, we'd seen the government try to take the initiative, try to suggest that Cairo was somehow returning to the ordinary. And what we saw yesterday were some of the biggest protests yet since this uprising began against President Mubarak's rule. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, that were some of the estimates that protesters offered. We've seen labor strikes today. We've seen unrest in other Egyptian cities. In some ways, it is a full-scale uprising. So it still feels very fluid. It's hard to see it as kind of a standoff between two sides. It's rather, I think, two forces of each able to wield its own power intersecting on almost a daily basis.
How would you describe the mood in Tahrir Square right now?
Well, I think it's jubilant in Tahrir Square. I mean, I think there's a sense that, among the protesters that they're creating something new, to say it most bluntly. They're creating, in some ways a paradigm of how they want to live. When you're checked by guards as you enter there, they apologize for any inconvenience, which stands in sharp contrast to the brutality of police here for so many years. You see people organizing themselves in terms of cleaning the streets, setting up pharmacies, a canteen that makes food, even a hospital to treat wounded in some of the clashes we saw last week. We're seeing, in some ways, a society grow from below, and it stands in marked contrast to what the state has represented for so many years in Egypt, and that is imposition of power from above. In other words, we're seeing a debate between two sides over whether power is sanctioned or imposed, and I think that's a really kind of a revelatory, it's a revealing insight into what this conflict is all about.
Mm-hmm. I was struck by a comment that Angela Merkel made at the Munich Security Conference this week, in which she compared Cairo to the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall in 1989, and her observation was, well, we just couldn't wait. even though rushing into democracy is probably without proper organization is probably not a great thing.
Well, I'll tell you, my own take on this, Byron, is that right now is the time when this revolution remains, I hate to use this word because it sounds judgmental, but in some ways very pure. What are people demanding out there? They're demanding the resignation of a president who's been in power for 30 years. They're demanding constitutional reform, free and fair elections, a sharp, if not absolute, curtailing of the power of the ruling party and ossified apparatus that basically has run this country through patronage and repression. These demands are in some ways almost expected, as part of this uprising against Mr. Mubarak's rule. But we have seen a certain dynamic that they become more radical as time goes on. They become angrier, and I think we are going to reach a break at some point. And when the protesters ask whether these peaceful protests, these in some ways not extraordinary demands, aren't met, what are the alternative means to press those demands? And I think we haven't reached that point yet. We've still seen very peaceful protests in some ways. The only time they've turned violent is when the government has turned its kind of goons and thugs against the protesters. But I don't think that's a status quo for the duration. In other words, I don't think these protests are going to stay peaceful for months and months.
Are we on the cusp of maybe a Central and Eastern European type regime change?
I don't think we are, and that's only because the Middle East is populated by governments that are so distinct in their identity, ideology, and history. I mean, what we had in Eastern Europe was pretty much one paradigm for rule. That was, Soviet-backed, communist regimes who shared much more than probably separated them. That's not the case in the Middle East right now, but what we do have across the Middle East is a demographic time bomb in some ways, and that is growing demands by youth for better governance. And this is probably the easiest way to put it. It's not ideologically driven. It's rather driven by material circumstances. People complain about corruption. They complain about unemployment. They complain about not having enough money to get married. These are demands of just everyday life, but we want a better everyday life. Those demands, like I said, are not being channeled right now, not being articulated by a certain movement. They're not being articulated by the Islamists. Leftist movements probably don't have the popular support to press those demands on the government. So it's really it is in some ways very much a popular uprising. It's a groundswell of opposition by youth predominantly about the way their lives are ordered, and they blame the government for that disorder. Now, how that goes forward, I think, is going to be the interesting dynamic in this uprising. It is going to be, can these youth find a way to articulate their voices in a methodical way to press the government, and can the government somehow reform without necessarily reforming? I don't think it's all that interested in overwhelming reform and still keep its power.
Do you think there are credible opposition leaders emerging?
Well, there's absolutely an opposition here, and that's the Muslim Brotherhood. But the Muslim Brotherhood in some ways was late to the uprising. It kind of joined it later on. It has tried to keep a back seat throughout the protests. It has not tried to emerge as somehow leadership. In terms of other leaders out there's a group of youth who are trying to claim leadership of this movement. There are older, more established leaders, opposition figures like Ayman Noor, or people like Mohammed al-Baradei, who was a Nobel laureate and lived most of his life abroad and has returned to Egypt and has sought to at least speak on behalf of some of the protesters. People often mention the name of the foreign minister, Ahmed Musa. But I think what's striking in some ways about what we're seeing is that there is no leader out there. There is no charismatic figure out there to claim the mantle of leadership of these protests. And there's also not a movement that right now is articulating the demands of the overwhelming majority of these protesters.
Yesterday, there was the release of a Google manager that gave a lot of celebration.
It's one of these figures that I mentioned of the kind of younger activists who are trying to emerge, trying to somehow represent the voices of these people who we see in the protest in Tahrir Square. He gave an interview to an independent Egyptian channel, which was riveting, to be honest. He broke down a couple of times as he talked about his ordeal and the ordeal of other people who lost their lives in this uprising, and it seemed to have an effect on people yesterday who flooded in Tahrir Square. Like I said earlier, the numbers there were bigger than we've ever seen since this uprising began. I think the question remains: will he be able to emerge as a more forceful figure? Will he be able to emerge as some kind of leader? That's still unclear. It's still very inchoate out there. It's still very ambiguous when we talk about the leadership of this movement.
It's sort of unusual that something like this would go on for 3 weeks. We're now into the so-called week of steadfastness.
Well, that's what the name they've used for it, is week of steadfastness. But I think in some ways we're in the very early stages of this. I mean, I think if you look at other kind of revolutionary situations or even uprisings in other countries, these things have often dragged on for months and even years, to be honest. The Iranian Revolution itself was if I'm remembering right, it was about a 2-year process. Even Tunisia lasted a month. So, we're only 3 weeks into this, and you do feel the uprising, at least the shape of it or the tone of it is changing. Today we've had labor strikes in Suez. We've had clashes out in a province, west of Cairo, as well as the tens of thousands of protesters in Tahrir Square still. They've also additionally organized a sit-in at the Parliament building. So I think we're seeing a situation that remains very fluid. And again, a situation when each side is trying to seize the initiative from the other.
You've been in and out of what translates as Liberation Square. Have you been accused of being a spy or had any of that unpleasantness that some of the guys walking around with camera crews have encountered?
Tahrir Square is, I guess, I'd say it's one of the more safer places in Cairo right now. There is definitely kind of a sense of jubilation down there. There's edginess at times of police trying to infiltrate the square, but overall it's more of a kind of a celebratory sense you have in Tahrir Square. I think it is a little more dangerous outside of the square, and I don't want to overstate it by any means, but the government has tried to fan the flames of anti-foreigner resentment through its media, newspapers and TV, in some ways trying to blame this unrest on foreigners. So you do get a different vibe outside of Liberation Square, and it's a vibe that it seems to ebb and flow a little bit, depending on what the government's saying on its own media.
Well, Cairo is a city of 18 million people. What is the mood outside of the square from the people who maybe haven't been there?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's almost a cauldron of sentiments out there. I mean, I think there's in some quarters you have a knee-jerk reaction in defense of President Mubarak, just among people who see him as a symbol of Egypt, and nationalism runs very deep here, and so there's almost a knee-jerk reaction in defense of him among some, even some who would loathe the government, who would hate what the government has done, would complain about the corruption, or complain about the repression of the police. Sometimes people will make a differentiation between the government and Mr. Mubarak himself. I think you also see deep support among some for the uprising and what it represents, this idea of youth pressing their demands for a government that's been just, remarkably unresponsive to their demands over so many years. And then I think you also see some kind of, mixed, opinions out there. People are a little bit frustrated with the toll this uprising has taken on the economy, a fear of chaos, a fear of instability. It's really, to say that there's one defining sentiment out there is pretty tough. It's actually very ambiguous, sometimes contradictory, but also very pitched in a way.
Vice President Suleiman was quoted as saying, Egypt may not be ready for democracy. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a cliche, and it's a cliche that's put forth by the government that this place isn't ready for democracy. I mean, I think a generation of Arab leaders have used this mantra of security and stability to try to claim legitimacy for their rule. And basically what that mantra means is that you exchange your right to govern, your right to rule, for stability. We'll secure stability, you give up your right to rule. I think that form of rule, that form of leadership is bankrupt at this point. I think what we're seeing in Egypt is the utter collapse of any claim it has to legitimacy. There's a groundswell of support for people to have a greater say in how they're governed. And I think what we hear from Omar Suleiman, for instance, Vice President, when he says that, is simply kind of it's almost an artifact of this older notion of leadership. I think if you ask the overwhelming majority of Egyptians right now, they would say absolutely, we are ready to have a far greater say in the way our lives are run.
Anthony, we're running out of time, but I know you have a book in progress. Could you tell us the subject and the tentative title and when we might be seeing it?
The book it's about the farthest cry you could do from what's happening in Egypt right now. It's actually I spent a year rebuilding my family's house in southern Lebanon, and through that rebuilding of the house, I try to tell a story of a lost Middle East, of a Middle East that's changed so much. In the years that house was built, abandoned, and then rebuilt. We're in the last stages of editing, so hopefully it's going to come out in this fall or spring. But you never know with the editing process. It might take a little longer.
Sure. And the tentative title is now what?
Well, you know what? We don't have a tentative title. I have one, but I don't want to say because I think it's going to change.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Thank you for joining us, Anthony Shadid of the New York Times.
Sure, my pleasure, Byron.